The world did not begin in darkness. It began in familiarity, a sky that felt closer than it does now, air that carried fewer names, land that did not yet belong to anyone. There were no borders to cross because nothing had been divided, no clocks because time had not learned to hurry, no sense that something was missing because nothing had been taken yet. People moved through the world slowly, not out of caution, but out of understanding. Every step carried weight. Every sound traveled farther than expected. And memory was not stored. It lived. It lived in repetition, in voices that repeated the same stories, night after night. Not because they feared forgetting, but because remembering felt natural. No one wrote anything down. There was no need. Words stayed where they were spoken. But then, at some point, the silence began to change. Not louder, not emptier, different. It was subtle enough that no one could name it. A pause that lasted a moment too long. A story that ended earlier than it used to. At first, it felt like rest. People slept more deeply. Dreams softened. The sharp edges of old memories began to blur, not painfully, but gently, the way distant hills fade into mist. Nothing felt wrong. That was the most unsettling part. No alarms were raised. No warnings passed from mouth to mouth. Because forgetting does not announce itself. It arrives disguised as peace. There were still elders then. People who carried more memory than others, simply because they had lived longer. They noticed first, not because they understood what was happening, but because they felt lighter. Certain memories no longer pressed on them when they closed their eyes. Certain details slipped away before they could be spoken. They began to hesitate, not out of fear, out of uncertainty. When they reached the parts of stories that once felt solid, their voices slowed. They searched for words that used to arrive without effort. Sometimes they stopped entirely, and no one interrupted them. Silence had become acceptable. In the evenings, when the light fell low and the wind moved through tall grass, people gathered as they always had. But something was different. The stories no longer stretched as far back as they once did. No one could remember when that started. This was not a primitive world. It was not chaotic. It was not lost. It was organized in a way that did not require rules. People knew where to go without maps. They recognized seasons without measuring them. They understood the sky not as a mystery, but as a presence. There were places where people did not linger, not because they were dangerous, but because they felt heavy, ground that held too many footsteps, stone that carried echoes even when no sound was made. These places were respected, not explained. Children were brought near them, but never inside. Not out of fear, out of instinct. No one said, "This is forbidden." They simply said nothing at all. And children learned quickly that some silences were intentional. Memory, in this world, was not individual. It was shared. If one person forgot, another remembered. If one voice faltered, another continued. That was how the past stayed alive. But that balance began to fail. Not abruptly, gradually. Fewer people remembered the same things. Stories began to fragment. Where once a single narrative flowed through many mouths, now there were variations. Small differences at first. A name that sounded slightly wrong. A place described as farther away than it used to be. No one corrected these changes. Correction requires confidence, and confidence had begun to fade. People still lived together, still gathered, still watched the sky. But the sense of continuity, the feeling that yesterday was directly connected to today, weakened. Time began to stretch, not forward, backward. The past started to feel distant, not because it was old, but because it was no longer accessible. There were no catastrophes during this period. No fires, no floods, nothing dramatic enough to mark the moment, which meant there would be no clear beginning to the forgetting. Only later, much later, would anyone realize that something had ended quietly. Some began to feel watched, not in a threatening way, more like being observed by something patient, something that did not intervene, something that waited. When people spoke of this feeling, they did so cautiously, as if naming it might cause it to retreat or return. The sky fell higher now. Stars still appeared, but their patterns felt harder to hold in the mind. People recognized them, but could no longer describe their movements as easily. Knowledge that once flowed effortlessly now required effort. And effort, when applied too often, becomes exhaustion. So people rested instead. They allowed themselves to forget small things. It felt harmless. After all, the world still worked. Food grew. Water flowed. Children were born. Life continued, which made it easier to ignore the absence. Those who still felt the weight of missing knowledge became quieter. They learned that speaking about what could no longer be remembered brought discomfort. Not anger, not fear, discomfort. And discomfort is often enough to stop a conversation. So the stories shortened again, not by force, by choice. People began to favor what felt lighter, easier to carry, the deeper memories, the ones that hinted at a time when humanity was more unified, more aware, more connected, slipped beneath the surface. Not erased, just unreachable. And somewhere beyond this quiet transition, a boundary settled into place. Not a wall, not a barrier, a limit, a soft, invisible edge beyond which memory no longer traveled. Humanity did not cross it again, not because it could not, but because it no longer knew there was something on the other side. For a time, forgetting felt gentle, like dusk, not night yet, just this soft dimming of edges. But gentleness does not last forever, because memory, once weakened, invites something else to take its place. Guidance. At first, it appeared as suggestion. Certain paths were walked less often. Certain questions were left unasked, not because answers were forbidden, but because they no longer felt necessary. People began to trust what remained instead of what was missing. And what remained was simpler, easier to repeat, easier to pass on. Stories that once required careful listening were replaced with shorter versions. Versions that fit neatly into an evening. Versions that did not linger after they were told. No one demanded this change. It happened quietly through preference, through relief, because carrying less memory made life feel lighter. But not everyone adjusted at the same pace. There were still a few who noticed patterns slipping out of alignment. They sensed that certain things used to connect, events, places, people that now felt isolated, disconnected. When they spoke about it, they did so softly, as if raising their voices might draw attention, not from others, from something else. These individuals did not call it control. They did not have a word for it. They only knew that remembering too much felt uncomfortable, heavy, as if their minds were pressing against a limit they could not see. Some described a sensation like standing at the edge of a thought and being unable to step forward. Others felt it as fatigue, sudden, unexplained tiredness when conversations drifted too far back. The body reacted before the mind could. And so people learned, unconsciously, where not to go. This was how the boundary worked. Not as punishment, as feedback. The world itself seemed to encourage restraint. Those who stayed within the invisible limits slept better, laughed more easily, felt less tension in their days. Those who pushed against it felt restless, disconnected, as if they were misaligned with the rhythm of life itself. Over time, most chose comfort, not because they were weak, but because they were human. Memory is not only knowledge, it is burden. And when the burden becomes too heavy, relief feels like mercy. This was when roles began to change. Leadership which had once been fluid, became defined. Certain individuals emerged as interpreters, not of memory, but of order. They did not claim to know the past better. They claimed to know how things should be. And that difference mattered. Instead of remembering together, people began to listen. Instead of sharing stories, they received them. The past became something delivered, not lived. This shift felt natural, necessary even, because uncertainty had grown uncomfortable. People wanted stability, and stability requires limits. The sky, once a shared reference point, became distant, still present, still watched, but no longer discussed in detail. Observations turned into symbols. Symbols turned into traditions. And traditions, once established, resist questions. Somewhere during this transition, the first records appeared, not as history, as administration. Marks made to track resources, seasons, obligations, nothing about origins, nothing about what came before. Because by then, even those who sensed the absence could no longer describe it clearly. They felt a loss, but not its shape. And loss without shape cannot be preserved, only felt, quietly, in moments before sleep. There is always a moment when a process becomes irreversible. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a point beyond which returning would require more effort than continuing forward. For humanity, that moment came without ceremony. A decision was made, not in a single place, not by a single voice, but from a perspective humans could not access. The boundary that had once been soft began to settle. Like wet clay hardening, memory did not disappear. It reorganized. Certain patterns were allowed to remain. Others were gently severed. Connections that once linked humanity to its first world were loosened until they no longer held. People could still imagine the past, but imagination replaced recollection. The difference mattered. Imagination can be shaped. Recollection resists. From this point on, remembering became selective, not because someone enforced it daily, but because the framework itself no longer supported deeper recall. The first civilization, whatever its true form had been, was no longer reachable as a coherent whole. Only fragments remained. Echoes, an unusual symbol carved into stone with no explanation. A story that felt older than its words. A sense that humans had once known more than they currently did. These fragments did not threaten the new order. In fact, they served it. They became myths. And myths do not challenge control. They decorate it. The beings who had overseen this transition did not disappear immediately. They withdrew. Distance replaced presence. Communication thinned. What had once been instruction became interpretation. And interpretation, over time, becomes belief. Belief does not require memory, only repetition. This was the final adjustment. Once belief replaced knowledge, the first civilization no longer mattered. Not because it was false, but because it was irrelevant to the new structure. Humanity could function without it. Governance could be established. Hierarchy could form. Institutions could grow. And institutions prefer stability over truth. The world became narrower, safer, more predictable. People learned their place in it. They accepted limitations they could no longer remember choosing. And in exchange, they were given continuity. Civilization progressed, slowly at first, then faster, because forgetting the first world freed humanity from comparison. There was no longer a memory of something greater to measure against. No sense that things had once been different. Only the present. Only what could be built now. This was not a punishment. It was a design, a controlled beginning. History, as we know it, could finally start. And it did. On top of silence. Civilization did not collapse. It adjusted. That was the quiet success of the design. Humanity continued forward without resistance, not realizing that something fundamental had already been decided. Cities formed again, but they were different this time. smaller in vision, more focused on control than understanding. Stone replaced memory. Where stories once flowed freely through voices, they were now fixed into walls, tablets, and laws. Writing emerged not to preserve the past, but to manage the present. Records were kept of grain, land, labor, and lineage, but not of origins. No one asked why the records began where they did. Beginnings are uncomfortable. They invite comparison, and comparison invites doubt. Instead, humanity learned to accept the world as it appeared. The gods, once present, once instructional, became distant. Not gone, just unreachable. Their presence shifted from guidance to authority, from voices to symbols, from shared experience to ritual. Temples rose where something older had once stood, not because people remembered what belonged there, but because they felt the absence, an emptiness strong enough to demand structure. Priests emerged as intermediaries, not because they knew more, but because they spoke with confidence. Confidence filled the gap left by memory, and people listened. The old feeling of being watched remained, but it changed. It no longer felt like observation. It felt like oversight, as if humanity had been left alone with instructions it could not fully read. Time moved faster now. Generations passed without carrying the same weight of recollection. Children learned their world as complete. They did not sense what was missing. Why would they? You cannot miss what you were never allowed to know. Occasionally, fragments surfaced, a story that felt too old. A king described as living far longer than seemed reasonable. A flood remembered not as weather, but as transition. These fragments did not disrupt the order. They were absorbed into belief. Belief softened them, turned them symbolic. Safe. The first civilization faded completely from shared awareness. Not erased, buried beneath usefulness. Humanity became skilled, ingenious, capable of building, conquering, and surviving. But something subtle was gone. A depth of perception, a continuity of self, the sense that the past was not behind them, but within them. Instead, history became something external, something learned, something owned by institutions, not lived. And so humanity advanced, productive, organized, and increasingly detached from its own beginning. The gods stepped further back, not out of anger, out of completion. Their role was finished. The framework held. Humanity no longer needed supervision, only maintenance. Now, in the modern silence, the world feels stable, predictable, contained. History stretches backward in clean lines, neatly labeled and carefully argued. But beneath those lines, there's a pause, a gap that never fully closed. Some feel it late at night, not as a thought, as a sensation, a quiet intuition that something foundational is missing, that the story starts too late, that the first chapter is gone. Sometimes it appears as restlessness, sometimes as fascination with ancient ruins that seem older than they should be, sometimes as a question that never quite forms. What came before us? And why does the answer feel intentionally distant? The past does not resist being remembered. It simply does not present itself. As if memory itself learned to obey a rule humanity forgot agreeing to. Perhaps the first civilization still exists, not in ruins, but in limitation, in the edges of thought that feel unreachable, in the instinct to stop asking certain questions, in the comfort found in not knowing. History tells us we began simply, slowly, ignorantly. But history only begins where memory is allowed. And memory was shaped, trimmed, engineered, not to weaken humanity, but to contain it. Because a species that remembers too much eventually asks why it must obey. The world moves forward now, efficient, measured, controlled, and it feels natural, which is the most effective design of all. Because when control feels natural, It no longer needs to be enforced. It only needs to be forgotten. History moved on, but it almost didn't. Forgetting was not taught in a single moment. It was introduced slowly as a habit. At first, it took the shape of preference. Some thoughts felt easier than others. Some questions led nowhere, while others brought comfort. Over time, people learned which paths of thought rewarded them with calm, and which ones led only to unease. The mind adapted. It always does. Complex memories became harder to hold, not because they were forbidden, but because they were unsupported. Like a bridge that is never repaired, they weakened through neglect. What had once been a continuous awareness of long cycles, generations flowing into one another, narrowed into something more manageable. Shorter timelines, clearer roles, defined purposes, human identity simplified. This was essential. A species burdened with too much memory eventually resists direction. It compares. It questions. It remembers alternatives. So alternatives were removed, not erased, disconnected. Human memory was reorganized around usefulness. What helped survival stayed. What encouraged obedience flourished. What invited reflection faded. Children no longer inherited memory directly. They inherited instruction. Stories were no longer living things that changed with the listener. They became fixed forms, predictable, safe. In this way, forgetting became generational. Each new generation started with less weight than the one before it. And because the reduction was gradual, it felt natural. No one mourns a loss they never fully experienced. The human mind learned to accept boundaries not as restrictions, but as reality itself. This was the true success of the design. Not control through force, but control through normalization. When cities rose again, they carried a strange emptiness. They functioned. They prospered. They endured. But they lacked something their builders could not name. These are not the first cities humanity had known. They were the first cities humanity remembered. And that distinction mattered. Architecture reflected this loss. Structures were impressive, yet strangely repetitive. Symbolic but shallow. The same motifs appeared again and again. Not because they were understood, but because they were inherited without context. Rituals formed around gestures whose origins were no longer known. Meaning was preserved in shape, but not in substance. Authority filled the gap. Kings, priests, and laws replaced memory as organizing forces. Instead of remembering how the world once worked, people were told how it should work now. And most accepted this gladly. Certainty feels better than depth. The gods, once teachers, became figures of distance and power. Their silence was interpreted as mystery. Their absence as holiness. What was once shared knowledge became sacred secrecy. This was not deception. It was adaptation. Humanity learned how to function without its first reference point. And in doing so, it became dependent on structures that claimed to represent order. Order replaced understanding. And with that, the final separation was complete. The first civilization no longer existed, even as a question, only as a faint discomfort beneath progress. Today, the world feels complete. Mapped, measured, cataloged. History appears to stretch back neatly, layer by layer, each era resting comfortably on the one before it. But that comfort is deceptive, because there's a depth that history never quite reaches. A silence beneath the earliest records. A sense that something foundational is missing, not destroyed but withheld. Modern humans carry this absence quietly. It appears in restlessness, in the feeling that progress never satisfies, in the suspicion that meaning should be deeper than productivity. We build faster than ever, communicate instantly, preserve data endlessly, and yet we feel strangely disconnected from ourselves, as if we arrived late to our own story. Perhaps this is the final consequence of engineered forgetting. Not ignorance, but displacement. A species untethered from its true beginning will always search for purpose, for origin, for something it cannot quite articulate. The ancient world does not haunt us because it was primitive. It haunts us because it was whole, and wholeness is threatening to systems built on control. If humanity were to remember its first civilization, not as myth, not as symbol, but as lived reality, it would change how we see ourselves. It would challenge the idea that we are incomplete by nature, that we must be guided, managed, contained. So forgetting remains, not enforced, maintained. The design persists not through power, but through habit, through education that begins too late, through history that starts where it is allowed to start, and through a quiet agreement, never spoken, never remembered, to stop asking certain questions. The world continues, functional, ordered, stable, and that stability feels natural, which is how forgetting was meant to feel. History moved on, but almost didn't. After the first civilization faded from awareness, something unexpected happened. The world did not feel emptier. It felt quieter, not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that comes from restraint. People spoke less about the distant past, not because they were told not to, but because there was nothing solid to hold on to anymore. When they reached backward in thought, they found smooth surfaces instead of edges. Nothing to grip. And the mind, when it cannot grip, lets go. This silence was not uncomfortable. It was soothing. It removed the tension of comparison. No longer was there a sense that humanity had fallen from something greater. There was only forward motion. Life simplified. Purpose narrowed. People woke, worked, rested, and slept within cycles that felt complete in themselves. The idea that something had been lost became unnecessary, because loss requires contrast, and contrast had been removed. In this new quiet, authority flourished effortlessly, not as domination, but as orientation. Humans looked outward for structure because inward reference had grown faint. Guidance felt natural. Rules felt stabilizing. Systems felt protective. And in exchange for that protection, something subtle was surrendered. Curiosity, not the surface kind, the practical curiosity that invents tools, but the deeper kind, the kind that asks why existence feels the way it does. The kind of curiosity slowly dissolved into abstraction. People still wondered, but they wondered safely, within accepted boundaries, within stories that circled rather than expanded. The silence held, and within it, humanity learned how to live without depth, without realizing depth had ever been part of them. Even now, that silence remains intact. Modern life is filled with noise, yet the deeper quiet persists beneath it. Information surrounds us, but understanding feels thin. We know many things. We remember almost nothing. Not of ourselves, not of where we began. Sometimes late at night, when the world slows and thought loses its sharpness, something stirs. Not a memory, a pressure, a sense that the story we were given starts too cleanly, that the beginning feels edited, as if a hand once moved across the page and decided where the narrative would be allowed to begin. Most people never linger on this feeling. They turn away from it instinctively, toward distraction, toward certainty, toward rest, because resting inside the design feels easier than questioning it. And that perhaps is the final layer of the engineering, not erasing the truth, not hiding it, but making the search for it feel unnecessary, uncomfortable, unproductive. So humanity sleeps, not physically, but historically, dreaming inside a carefully shaped past, living inside a present that feels complete, never quite realizing that something essential was left behind, not stolen, set aside, for a reason that no one remembers agreeing to. History moved on, but it almost didn't. After forgetting became stable, humanity stopped noticing the absence. Not because the absence disappeared, but because it blended into daily life. A missing sense can only be felt when there is a reference for it, and reference had been removed. The world no longer felt like a fragment of something greater. It felt whole, contained. People grew up believing that uncertainty was natural, that not knowing origins was simply part of being human. Questions about beginnings were treated as abstract curiosities, not necessities. Interesting, optional, unimportant. This shift shaped everything. Education focused on function, not continuity. History was taught as a sequence of improvements, not as a memory of identity. The past became a resource, not a presence. Something to study, not something to feel. Children learned early how to locate themselves in the present. They were taught who they were allowed to be, not where they truly came from. And because this limitation was inherited rather than imposed, it felt harmless, natural. The world rewarded those who adapted quickly. Those who questioned deeply often felt misaligned, not punished, just unsupported, as if the structure of reality itself leaned away from certain lines of thought. Over time, people learned to self-correct. They redirected attention. They simplified wonder. They accepted the surface. This was not intellectual decline. It was specialization. Humanity became extremely good at operating within boundaries it no longer perceived. Efficiency increased. Comfort increased. Depth faded quietly into irrelevance. And because life functioned smoothly, there was no reason to resist. Yet forgetting was never perfect. It could not be. Some impressions are too deeply embedded to be fully removed. They survive not as memory, but as intuition. This is why certain places feel heavier than others. Why ruins evoke more than curiosity. Why ancient landscapes seem to carry an atmosphere that cannot be explained by age alone. These are not memories returning. They are echoes interacting with limits. Humanity does not remember the first civilization, but it reacts to it, in the same way the body reacts to a sound before the mind identifies it. A subtle unease, a pull, a recognition without context. This is why myths persist across cultures that never met. Why stories of gods descending, teaching, withdrawing, and erasing appear again and again. Not because they are factual records, but because they are pressure marks, imprints left behind when memory was compressed. The mind fills gaps with symbolism. It always has. And so the first civilization survives as metaphor, as longing, as a suspicion that the human story began earlier and more deliberately than we are allowed to assume. These remnants are not dangerous on their own. They become dangerous only when connected, which is why they are kept separate, fragmented, categorized, turned into entertainment, belief, or speculation. Never synthesis, never continuity. As long as the fragments remain isolated, the structure holds. And it does. There is comfort in forgetting. This is perhaps the most difficult truth to face. Remembering a greater origin would come with responsibility, with expectation, with the burden of comparison. If humanity once knew more, then forgetting was not accidental. And if forgetting was not accidental, then the present is not neutral. These thoughts carry weight. They disrupt rest. They invite dissatisfaction. So the system, whatever its origin, does not need to suppress them. It only needs to make forgetting feel preferable. And it succeeds. Most people are content. They find meaning in relationships, routines, ambitions, and rest. They do not feel oppressed. They do not feel incomplete. They feel human. which suggests that the engineering of forgetting was not designed to harm. It was designed to stabilize, to limit potential volatility, to keep humanity focused on the immediate rather than the eternal. In this light, forgetting is not cruelty. It is management, and management, when invisible, is rarely questioned. As the world slows towards sleep, the mind becomes less guarded. Edges soften, thoughts drift, and sometimes, in that space between waking and rest, a strange feeling emerges. Not fear, not clarity, a sense of being slightly out of place in time, as if the present is real, but not complete. Most people let this feeling pass. They turn over, they sleep, and the system holds. Tomorrow arrives. Life continues. History advances. Clean, organized, contained, and somewhere beneath all of it, untouched by progress or denial, the first civilization remains exactly where it was left. Not destroyed, not hidden, simply unremembered. History moved on, but it almost didn't.